Good morning, students. So far we discussed about the Japan, China, Taiwan, and then we discussed about the Korea. And we discussed about the major political developments of Korea. We discussed in the last topic that Korea was ruled by a military dictator, Park Chung-hee. Later on he was elected as the president, but in the end he amended the constitution of Korea illegally and he introduced a new constitution that was called as the Yusin constitution. And his Yusin constitution gave him an ultimate power to remain the president of Korea till his death. So that was not accepted by the people. People started a protest against that Yusin constitution, and finally Park Chung-hee was forced to resign. So what happened thereafter? Was there a democracy in Korea thereafter, or was another rule, the same kind of rule, military rule? So that we will discuss today. So what happened after the resignation of Park Chung-hee? You can see from the slide that continued economic growth and calls for the democratization. In December 1979, another military coup, this time led by Chundu Hawan, was staged. So in 1979, when Park Chung-hee resigned from the post, the Korea was not able to retain its democracy, and there was another military coup which was staged thereafter, and this time it was staged by Chundu Hawan. You can see from the image, this man is Chundu Hawan, who became a military dictator of Korea. In May 1980, various protests in key cities around nation was held. Students and citizens demanding democracy in the face of Chun's military faction. The military faction suppressed the democracy movement. So people were demanding for the democracy. As a result, they stood against the Chundu Hawan and they started a democratic movement against him. But that movement could not be successful as it was suppressed by the army of Chundu Hawan. So democratic demand of the people was suppressed by him, and mainly these demands were made by the students of Korea. Gwangju democratization movement, that was the movement which was started against his rule, and Chun's military faction suppressed the protest for the democratization. Later that same year in 1980, Chundu Hawan became a president. So how he became a president of Korea? Earlier he was a military dictator who brought a military coup in Korea, but later on he became the president of Korea, but he was not through the direct election, rather he was elected through the indirect election, and that indirect election was there under the Yusin constitution. So the Yusin constitution, which was criticized by the people, and because of this Yusin constitution, the Park Chung-hee had to resign. The same constitution was used by Chundu Hawan to become the president of Korea later on. Now, what happened after becoming the president of Korea? What were the Chundu Hawan's policy that we will discuss here? So, continued economic growth and calls for the democratization. So, under the leadership of Chundu Hawan, there was the rapid growth as well as there was also a demand to bring democracy in the South Korea. During the international economic boom, the Chun's administration was able to raise economic growth from 1.7% to 13.2%. So that was a major achievement of Chundu Hawan. Earlier the growth rate was 1.7%, but within 3 years the growth rate reached up to 13.2%. So that was a major success of Chundu Hawan, and this retained him in the position of the president. Economic development had led to urbanization, improved educational level, and media advancement. So in other fields there was also development under the leadership of Chundu Hawan. Citizens' self-awareness about political rights grew, leading to demand for the constitutional amendment to allow direct election of the president. So there was a lot of demand for the democracy, and this demand increased after the spread of education. Now the common people started demanding that there should be a direct election there should be no indirect election, as this provision has been made in the Yusin constitution by the Park Jung-hee, and Chundu Hawan was also a president under the Yusin constitution. Now the people started demanding the constitutional amendment which could abolish the provision of indirect election under the Yusin constitution. So they wanted to abolish the Yusin constitution. In May 1987, the Chun's administration minimization of inquiries into the death by torture of a university student. So there was protest going on against the Chundu Hawan for the amendment of constitution and to allow a direct election, to revoke the democracy in Korea, and this movement was initially led by the students. Initially it was suppressed by the Chundu Hawan's military regime. Later on the protest again grew, but this time it was suppressed, and one student who was protesting against the Chun's administration, he was captured by the police, he was arrested by the police, and he died because of the torture of the police. So this led to this provoked the anger among the Korean people. Now they also came in the forefront, and they also started supporting the students who were protesting against the Chun's military administration. As a result, there was a large-scale movement which compelled the Chundu Hawan to make amendment in the constitution, and finally he had to allow the direct election for the president. So revision of constitution was made because of this large-scale protest against the Chun's administration. Now, when there was a direct election after the amendment of the constitution, Chundu Hawan could be no more in the position of the president. As a result, there was an election which was held in 1987, and in this election, one follower of Chundu Hawan became the president of Korea, and that was Roh Tae-wood. He was also the supporter of Chundu Hawan, and he also adopted the same policy, but now he was a legally elected president through a direct election. But at the same time, there were some opposition parties, and one opposition leader was Kim Young-sam, who was an opposition leader of a major opposition party who was raising the issues for the public against this government. But later on, this president of an opposition party also joined hand with the Roh Tae-wood. So he also joined his hand with the Roh Tae-wood, and both Kim Young-sam and Roh Tae-wood became the partner. As a result, the ruling party became more stronger, and they started implementing their policies. So in December 1992, Kim, a civilian, was elected the president after decades of military rule. Then again election was held after 5 years, after 1987. The next election was held in 1992, and in that 1992, Kim was a civilian who was elected a president after a long time military rule, because all these leaders were from the military background. Park Jung-hee was from military background. Later on, Chundu Hawan, who became the president, he was also from military background, and this one, that was Roh Tae-wood, he was also from the military background. But now a civilian came into the power, and his name was the Kim. Under the export-driven policy of the new administration, several companies grew to a global prominence which continued until early 1990. So Kim's policy was export-oriented policy. They wanted to increase the export of Korea so that much needed foreign exchange can be brought in the Korea, and he encouraged the large-scale industries, and this continued till 1990s. With government support, Korean conglomerates invested in capital-intensive heavy and chemical industries. So the government was supporting the industrialization. As a result, large business houses invested their money in the rapid industrialization, and large industries were developing in Korea. Business houses were there, conglomerates were investing a lot in the field of industrialization of Korea. So what was the outcome of that rapid industrialization of Korea and heavy investment by the conglomerates? That we will discuss. Now, Next is Korean democracy and the IMF crisis. As we discussed that government was supporting the industrial economy and there was a huge investment by the conglomerates. So what was the outcome? Meanwhile, under increasing neoliberal pressure to open its market, Kim's administration joined the OECD. So in 1996, the Kim's government became a member of OECD, and that was an international organization, and it was the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And in this way, Korea's economy was open. As a result, now Korean companies started facing stiff competition from the other companies of other countries. As a result, there was the trade deficit because this led to the stiff competition, and because of this stiff competition, now Korean industries products were not in the world demand in the world market. As a result, the import increased and export decreased. So the Korean economy was facing a trade deficit. There was a loss in the international trade. And second reason was the poor management of financial institution. So new institution which rose during the export-driven policy of government, they were not managing their institution properly. So that was also a reason for the decline of economy of Korea. Reckless business operations by conglomerates led Korea to a foreign currency crisis in 1997. And conglomerates which were encouraged by the government's policy, they invested huge, and this huge investment led to the deficit of foreign exchange. This led to the decline of foreign exchange, and foreign exchange was required for the international trade. As a result, now Korea was facing an economic crisis. As a result, Korea's economy reached to the level of bankruptcy. So how the Korea's economy could be saved, that we will discuss. The crisis was dealt with through an emergency financial support, and that was provided by IMF. So here comes the role of IMF. IMF means International Monetary Fund. So IMF provides loan to the countries who are requiring it, who are demanding it. So the Korea's economy was collapsing, it was declining. As a result, they took a huge loan from the IMF, International Monetary Fund. And because of the loan, now there was a burden on Korea's economy, and how to repay the loan, that was a question. So government started a movement to repay the loan, and it asked the people of the Korea to support to repay the loan to the IMF. As a result, there was a movement which was started, and that movement was called as the gold collection movement, in which the ordinary people used to give gold to the government so that the government could repay the loan which was taken from the IMF. And this movement became successful. As a result, Korea's economy was saved in this way. In December 1997, long-time opposition party leader Kim Dae-jung became the president of Korea, and this is first time in Korea that there was a peaceful transition of power from one president to another president without any broad mass movement. So without any opposition, without any military faction, without any movement, now it was a peaceful transfer of power, and the president of Korea was changed peacefully in 1997 through a direct election. The second peaceful transition of power that took place in 2008 after 11 years of 1997, when another leader, his name was Lee Myung-bak, was elected as the president of Korea. Then in 2012, again there was a peaceful transition of power, and long-time opposition leader Park Geun-hye became the president of Korea, and she was the first female president of Korea. Now, who was Park Geun-hye? Park Geun-hye was the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was the first military dictator of Korea. Now Park Geun-hye became the president of Korea because he was having a strong political background. But in 2016, a movement was also started against her, and under that movement, she had to resign because she was exposed that one of her friend was controlling all the government businesses. Her friend was indirectly making all the policies of the government, and indirectly her friend was ruling the government. So she was exposed. As a result, the Korean people started a protest against this leader, and there was a candle march against this leader throughout the country, and finally she had to resign in 2017. So that was also a success of the democratic movement through which a president could be removed. So that tells us about the maturity of Korean democracy, because the movement was not suppressed brutally as it used to be suppressed earlier. So that tells us about that Korea now became a mature democracy. In May 2017, Moon Jae-in was elected the president in a peaceful transfer of power for the third time, and the candlelight protest that was in 2016 led by the citizens who peacefully demonstrated for the president's resignation within the boundaries of democratic law and system show the maturity of the Korean democracy. So again there was a peaceful transfer of power and a new person became the president, and now Korea has attained its maturity and it is a mature democracy, and it is moving on the path of modernization, and Korea has become a very modern economy of Eastern Asia, and this tells us that Korea has achieved huge success in the field of democracy. And you can see from the picture also, this is the nighttime image of Seoul, which is the capital of Korea. This tells us that how developed urbanization is there in Korea, and this is itself a testimony of Korea's development. So that's all about the story of Korea's modernization. Now we discussed the modernization of 4 countries. We discussed the stories of 4 countries, and we saw how these countries developed to be a modern economy in the world. The modernization of China, modernization of Japan, modernization of Taiwan, and modernization of Korea. So they followed different paths to become a modern economy in the world, and their path was different from each other. So there were many paths of modernization. So here we are comparing the 2 paths of modernization. One is of China and second one is of Japan. So how they were different in their policies and what was the historical background of their modernization, that we are comparing here. So first of all, Japan. Japan was successful in retaining its independence and using traditional skills and practices in new ways. So Japan was having a fear initially that it would be colonized like the other countries of Asia by the Western power, but somehow it was able to retain its independence, its freedom, and it also used its cultural values to defend from the colonization. Its elite-driven modernization generated an aggressive nationalism, helped to sustain a repressive regime that stifled dissent and demands for democracy and established a colonial empire. So Japan was having a fear that it would be colonized. As a result, they made their army stronger and they centralized the power of the government in the hand of the emperor so that it could be better defended. As a result, there was the elite-driven phenomena and there was a rise of nationalism in Japan, and that nationalism ultimately led to the imperialism of Japan, and Japan became a colonial power of East Asia like the Western world. And that's why it left a legacy of hatred in the region as well as distorted internal development. So because of imperial policy of Japan, now there was hatred against the Japan because it invaded almost all the neighboring countries in this region. As a result, every country of this region was having a hate against the Japan. And secondly, because it was having an imperial policy, so it did not pay much attention towards the welfare of the people and towards fulfilling their daily needs of the people. As a result, there is a distorted development in the Japan at that time which we are talking here. Then what happened in China at the same time? Foreign imperialism, both Western and Japanese, combined with the weak king dynasty to set the stage for the breakdown of political and social order, leading to immense misery for most of the people. In China, the situation was different. Foreign imperialism was there in China. China was a colony of Japan, as well as many parts of China was under the control of the Western power. And it also got a defeat at the hand of the British forces in Opium War. It also got a defeat at the hand of Japanese in Sino-Japanese War, Sino-Japanese War. And the dynasty which was ruling China at that time, that was the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was not able to keep China free from the colonization. As a result, the people of China suffered a lot because of a weak dynasty which was ruling China. Warlordism, banditry and civil war exacted a heavy toll on human lives, as did the savagery of the Japanese invasion. So warlordism was there in China, where the maximum area of China was controlled by the warlords. There was banditry in China, and there was civil war. There was a civil war because there were two parties, Kuomintang and CCP, and they were fighting against each other. So these things resulted in a heavy loss to the China's economy, and ultimately there was the savagery of Japanese invasion. Japan invaded China, and because of that, Chinese people suffered a lot. The 19th and 20th century saw a rejection of the traditional and a search for a ways to build national unity and strength. Now China and Chinese leadership understood that by following the idealism of Confucius, they would not be able to modernize their economy, and they would not be able to defend their nation. So they rejected the traditional ideas which they were following earlier, and they adopted the new ideas so that there can be a strength and there can be unity among the people of China. Now, what are other causes and what are other differences of the path to modernization of China and Japan? Many Japanese hope to liberate Asia from Western domination. For others, these ideas justified building an empire. So when Japan was becoming an imperial power, so there were two ideologies. One was that people of Japan believed that they should liberate Asia from the Western powers, whereas a category of people were also the believer that they should become an imperial power, and they should also colonize other countries like the Western powers. So the two ideologies were conflicting at the same time in Japan. It imitated Western powers. It also attempted to find its own solution. So most of the things in Japan was adopted from the Western world, and there was also a voice in the Japan that Japan should become a part of Western world. So it imitated the Western world, but at the same time there were people, they also thought that they should also preserve their cultural heritage, their traditional heritage. So Japan found its own solution for its own problem. Then what happened in China? The CCP and its supporters fought to put an end to the tradition which they saw as keeping the masses in poverty, the women subjugated, and the country undeveloped. Now CCP thought about the problem of China, and they thought that China is a poor country, so they should eradicate the poverty. Women were subjugated, that should be stopped, and country was underdeveloped, that has to be a developed country. So they started making the policies for the development of China and to end all the inequalities in China. It did remove centuries old inequalities, spread education, and raise consciousness among the people. For this, the party focused on spreading the education among the people so that China could be made developed by the 20th century. They raised the consciousness of the people against the foreign imperialism and humiliation of China. As a result, they aggressively started their policies to make China a developed country. Next is transformation of social and political institution and a daily life was not just a question of reviving traditions or tenaciously preserving them, but rather of creatively using them in new and different ways. Now Japan became a modern country, and that led to the industrialization of Japan. But this urbanization and industrialization led to the nuclear family system. Earlier there was a joint family system in Japan, but this nuclear family system was a new thing in Japan, and they were copying the Western ideas. But at the same time, they focused that their cultural values should be preserved, So daily life transformation was there in Japan at that time when it was having a rapid industrialization. The Meiji school system modeled on European and American practices introduced new subjects, but the curriculum's main objective was to make loyal citizens. There was a lot of changes in the education system also, and that was done during the Meiji restoration period. But the focus of the education was to make the Japanese a loyal citizen, so they inculcated the feeling of nationalism among the Japanese. Though they introduced the Western sciences, Western technology in their education, but at the same time they were able to preserve their cultural heritage, their national pride. Now what happened in China? It had been successful in making China economically powerful, but its political system continues to be tightly controlled. Now China started many policies to become a developed economy like Great Leap Forward movement, proletarian cultural movement, and these movements were started to make China a developed country. But these movements led to centralize all the power of China into one party's hand, and that party was CCP. So there is centralization of power in the hand of CCP and its leaders. As a result, the people are having less rights in China. The society now faces growing inequalities as well as a revival of traditions long suppressed. So CCP followed the policy to leave the traditional ideas, but now again there is a demand to revive all the traditional ideas which were inspired by the teachings of Confucius, who was the old religious leader of China, ancient religious leader of China. And there is also a growing inequalities in China. The inequalities which CCP programmed to remove, that is still there. So that is a problem in China. But overall, China is a developed economy and Japan is also a developed economy. But you can see from the history of China and Japan that they followed different path for the development. China followed a different path and Japan followed a different path.